Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of macroeconomics. And this time we're gonna be looking at chapter 4, and chapter 4 has to do with one of my favorite topics in macroeconomics, which is basically GDP, which I think is really relevant right now. Where we can't talk about GDP without talking about the elephant in the room right now. And currently, as you all know, we're actually in a regression, and make no mistake about that. Okay, so GDP, basically think of it as a measure of production or productivity levels in a country. Okay, so now let's look at the United States GDP. So this is basically United States GDP growth over the last few years. Actually, this is quarterly GDP growth, right? And as you can tell, GDP has actually fallen by 31.7% since the second quarter. And this is largely due to the fact that we actually had the COVID pandemic, right? So we actually went into a lockdown, so majority of businesses had to close, and GDP fell by almost 32% compared to the last quarter. In fact, the lowest fall in GDP since 2008, even since the recession, the devastating financial recession we had, GDP has never fallen to these levels before, right? Lots of people have lost their jobs, lost incomes, businesses have closed down, and GDP basically measures all these things, okay? So, for example, to measure or to know whether we're actually in a recession or an economic expansion, we basically need to measure GDP. Okay, so GDP is really, really important in the field of macroeconomics. Again, it's an indicator of how well the economy is doing. Okay, so in this chapter, we're basically going to examine what really is GDP and what does it tell us about the state of the economy. Okay, and how do those at the BEA, also known as the Bureau of Economic Analysis, actually measure GDP. Okay, so we know that we're in a recession right now. Currently, US GDP has fallen to 19.5 trillion. Pre-recession or pre-pandemic, right? The GDP of the United States was 21 trillion, right? And it has been on an upward trend. The shaded areas basically show you periods in which we actually had a recession, okay? And during a recession, GDP basically decreases, and during an economic expansion, GDP basically increases, okay? But the current GDP of the United States as of the second quarter, right? So quarter is basically every 3 months, right? So as of the second quarter, GDP in the United States is 19.5 trillion, okay? And hopefully it will go back up later on, right? But this main chapter is talking about GDP. What is GDP? Okay, so that is what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so again, I always go through the learning objectives. I believe the learning objectives are really, really important, right? Once you master the learning objectives, right, you basically are set for the chapter. Okay, right. So the first thing we'll do is we'll find what GDP is. What does GDP even stand for, right? What is GDP, and how is GDP related to what we call aggregate expenditure? Okay, aggregate expenditure basically means spending in the economy. Okay, we'll also explain how the Bureau of Economic Analysis, also known as the BEA, measure US GDP and what we call real GDP. Okay, so we'll look at real GDP in more detail later. We'll learn how to calculate real and nominal GDP. And finally, we'll explain the uses and limitations of real GDP as a measure of economic well-being. Okay, so is real GDP a good measure of the economy? Is it a good measure of how people are doing in the economy, right? So usually as economists, we know that when GDP decreases or when GDP goes down, incomes also drop, okay? And people's economic well-being suffer as a result. But is GDP the only way of actually measuring economic well-being, right? These are the four main things we actually explore in this chapter, okay? So it's gonna be an interesting ride because this is relevant to what's happening right now, okay? So the first thing we need to do is go through the definition of GDP, right? So GDP basically stands for gross domestic product, okay? So GDP stands for gross domestic product, okay? And GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given time period, okay, is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period. Okay, so that is GDP. Okay, and this definition is so loaded, we actually have to unpack it. Okay, so this definition has four main parts. Okay, the first part is the market value. We need to find out what really is market value. Remember, I said GDP is roughly $19 trillion, right? So GDP is actually quoted in dollars, right? Or in numbers, okay? So that has something to do with the market value, okay? So what really is the market value? Okay, we also said GDP is the market value of all final goods and services. So what really is a final good, okay? What really is a final service? We need to take a look at that, okay? GDP, we also said, is produced within a country. Okay, so for something to be part of GDP, so currently the United States GDP is $19.5 trillion, right? For something to actually be constituted as GDP, right, or be part of this $19.5 trillion, it has to be produced within the United States, okay? And finally, it has to be produced within a given time period, okay? So these are the four main parts of GDP, right? Is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period, okay? So now we need to dissect all of these four different parts. The first part we'll look at is the market value. What does it mean to be a market value? Okay, market value is basically prices at which an item is traded on the market. Okay, so that is the meaning of a market value. It's basically the prices at which an item is traded on the market. Okay, so if, for example, if I walk into Walmart and one apple costs $2, that is the market value of the apple. Okay. If I walk into Walmart and a bottle of wine costs $20, that is the market value of that bottle of wine. Okay. So the price at which an item is basically quoted is the market value. Okay. So let's say you bought a watch for $150, right? That is the market value of the watch. Okay, so essentially that is the market value, right? So GDP, right? Remember we said measures productivity. So basically what a country produces, right, in a given year is put into GDP, right? But a country produces so many different goods. A country produces apples, a country produces oranges, computers, popcorn, it produces laptops, it produces notebooks, it produces a whole lot of stuff, right? Phones, TVs, electronics, it produces a plethora of stuff, okay? So how do we actually sort of measure a country's productivity? So for example, if a country produces 100 oranges and 50 apples, is it the same as 100 apples and 50 oranges, even though the numbers add up? Can we compare oranges and apples really? Okay, so that's why we actually need to find a market value. Okay, so to add apples and oranges and to add up various goods and services, we need to find their market value so we can find the total value of output in dollars. Okay, so this is really important. Okay, so let's do an example. For an example, an economy, let's think of maybe some simple economy, produces 10 computers and 200 oranges. Okay, this economy produces only two goods, 10 computers and 200 oranges. A computer will cost $250. Okay, so that is the market price of one computer, and an orange costs $5. Okay, so now to find the market value, right, we said GDP is the market value of all goods and services produced within a country. To find the market value of computers, we take the price of computers and multiply it by the number of computers produced in this economy. So the market value of computers in this economy is 2,500. Okay, we also take the market value of oranges. So that is the price of oranges times the number of oranges produced in this economy, and that is $1,000. And then we basically add it up to find the total market value, and that is going to be our GDP in this economy. Okay, so the total market value of a good is also equivalent to the GDP. Okay, so that is how we find the market value of all goods and services. Okay, so this $19.5 trillion, right, is the market value of all goods and services produced in the United States, and it adds up to $19.5 trillion. Okay, so that is how we find GDP using the market value approach, and we'll go to other approaches later on. Okay, so that's the first component of GDP, the market value. Hopefully, you understand this. Okay. The next component of GDP is we said GDP consists of the market value of all final goods and services. Okay, so what is a final good? Well, to actually understand a final good, we need to actually explain the definition of a final good. Okay, so a final good is an item bought by its final user during a specific time period. Okay, so if I go into Walmart and let's say I buy ice cream, okay, and I come back home and I watch Netflix and I eat that ice cream. Okay, cookies and cream is my favorite kind of ice cream, by the way. Okay, and I am really happy because I bought the ice cream. Okay, so let me draw a happy face because I can. Right, the ice cream I bought is basically a final good. Okay, that ice cream I bought is basically a final good. Okay, I bought the ice cream for my own personal consumption. Suppose I walk into Walmart and I buy a TV. Okay, and I take it back home. That good is basically a final good. It's for my own personal consumption. So think of goods for your own personal consumption. Maybe an iPhone, a Samsung Galaxy, the PS4, a clothing. Something for your own personal consumption tends to be a final good. And that is included in GDP. Conversely, we have what we call an intermediate good. An intermediate good is a good that is bought by a firm to produce another good, okay, and is used as a component of a final good or a service. Okay, so for example, suppose Applebee's, okay, Applebee's goes into Walmart and they buy a tomato. Okay, so they buy a tomato, right? And Applebee's uses that tomato for, let's say, chicken salad, right? Well, that tomato they bought is basically an intermediate good because it was used for chicken salad, which was actually a final good for someone else, okay? But suppose I go into Walmart and I buy a tomato for my own personal use, then this tomato is considered as a final good, okay? So you need to know the difference between an intermediate good and a final good, okay? Suppose Apple buys a chip, okay, and they use this chip in making the iPhone. Okay, this chip is basically an intermediate good. Okay, suppose maybe Ford buys a tire and they use this tire in making, let's say, a car. This tire is basically an intermediate good. So think of an intermediate good as any good that is used to basically make a final good. Okay, so differentiating between final good and intermediate good basically prevents us from double counting, right? So it's really important to understand this, right? But whether a good is a final good or intermediate good basically depends on what this good is going to be used for, okay? If it's going to be used for someone's own personal consumption, then it tends to be a final good. If it's going to be used in producing another good, then it tends to be an intermediate good, okay? So just to make sure you guys actually understand it, I have a few activities that you need to try out, right? So I want you to determine whether the following items are a final good or a service or an intermediate good or a service. Airline tickets bought by Connor. So Connor is a student, all right? Airline tickets bought by Connor, is it a final good or an intermediate good? Yeah, you're right. It's basically a final good, okay? So it's a final good. New airplanes bought by Southwest Airlines. Are the airplanes a final good or an intermediate good or a service? Well, it's an intermediate good because remember, Southwest Airlines are going to use that airplane for transportation. Okay, so transportation is basically a service. So in this case, it is an intermediate good. Tomato sauce bought by Domino's. Well, tomato sauce is going to be used for making pizza by Domino's. So in that sense, it's an intermediate good. Sarah buys a new iPhone. The iPhone bought by Sarah is basically a final good, and a new house bought by Jeff Bezos is also a final good. Okay, so that is the difference between a final good and intermediate goods, and hopefully you understand them right now. Okay, right. The next component of GDP we're looking at is produced within a country. Okay, so GDP basically measures productivity or output within a country. Okay, so we know that Honda, right, is a Japanese car, right? But if Honda was made in, let's say, Detroit, somewhere in Detroit, it is basically part of US GDP. Why? Because it is actually made in Detroit. So despite the fact that it's actually a Japanese car, it is actually included in US GDP. Okay, let's take, for example, Samsung. Okay, so Samsung is basically a Korean phone, right? Let's say Samsung was made in Silicon Valley, so California. Okay, since Samsung is actually made in the United States, it's actually included in US GDP, okay, and not in Korea's GDP. Okay, let's take a look at Nike. Nike is an American company, right? But if Nike shoes are made in China, then those shoes are included in China's GDP, not the United States GDP. Okay, so the good has to be produced within a country. Okay, the good has to be produced within a country. Okay, and then it also has to be produced within a certain given time period. Okay, it has to be produced within a certain given time period. Okay, so usually GDP is measured annually or quarterly. Okay, GDP is usually measured annually or quarterly. Okay, right. So GDP is basically linked to income and at the same time is linked to expenditure. Okay, and we use what we call a circular flow diagram to explain how GDP is linked to expenditure and how GDP is basically linked to income. Okay, right. So GDP measures the value of production, which also equals total expenditure and also equals total income. Why total expenditure and total income? Basically, what you spend, which is your income, or what you earn, sorry, which is your income, is basically equals to what you spend. Okay, so that's why we have the link of total expenditure and total income. Okay, right? And the equality of income and value of production shows the link between productivity and living standards. So GDP basically shows us living standards, okay, or is a good indicator of living standards, right? And we use what we call the circular flow diagram to show how income is basically linked to expenditure. Okay, how income is basically linked to expenditure. Okay, right. So the circular flow diagram basically shows us bits and pieces of the economy. Okay, bits and pieces of the economy or snapshots of the economy. Okay, so we have households who are basically consumers, people like you and me, firms, okay, governments, and essentially the rest of the world. Okay, so this is how our circular flow diagram is going to look like. You're going to have households, and you don't need to know how to actually draw the circular flow diagram. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to draw the circular flow diagram, so you don't need to learn how to draw it. But basically, it helps you understand the economy. Okay, we have firms, we have governments, we have the rest of the world, we have what we call the goods market, and I explain these things in more detail, and we have what we call the factor markets. Okay. Right, so let's look at the first components of the economy, so which is basically households and firms. So when we say households, think of households as basically consumers, okay? People like you, people like me, basically we are households, okay? So households and firms, right, sell and buy services of labor, capital, land, and entrepreneurship. Okay, so these services are known as factors of production. Right? These services are known as factors of production. Okay, so labor is basically workers, for example. Capital is basically machinery. Land is basically just natural resources, and entrepreneurship is basically sort of a person who manages labor, capital, and land. Okay, so for example, I'm part of a household. Remember, I'm a consumer, right? I sell my labor to basically the firm, which is Wartburg College, in what we call the factor market. Okay, so I give my labor to Wartburg College, and Wartburg Colleges basically buys my labor. Okay, so the factor market is where factors of production, which is labor, capital, land, and entrepreneurship, are basically bought and sold. Okay, so Wartburg pays me in wages. Okay, so firms pay wages for labor services. Okay, if they actually rent machine or if they actually buy machine, we call it interest. So that's interest for the use of capital, right? If they actually have a land, they pay rent for the use of land. Okay, and profit for what we call entrepreneurship. Okay, so let's say you own a coffee shop. Okay, you own a coffee shop and you got workers over there, you got coffee machines and everything, and let's say you rent a building. Okay, so you pay wages to your workers in a coffee shop, right? The interest you pay on your machines, let's say you go to the bank to actually borrow money to actually put these machines in place because they're really expensive, right? The interest you pay basically is also interest on capital. And let's say you're actually renting a building, right? You need to pay rent. Okay, so that is rent for the use of land. Okay, and profit is basically what you earn. Okay, so that essentially is the factor market. Okay, right. So firms basically pay income to households. So okay, so I sell my labor to Wartburg College, and they in turn pay me income. Okay, and that is what we're gonna show in our circular flow diagram. Okay, so firms pay income. So income is basically the blue line. Firms pay income, okay, because they buy the factors of production used to make their own goods, right? And they pay income to households, okay? Right, so the income is basically Y. So this Y is basically income, okay? Right, so you have firms buying factors of production, and these factors of production are in turn going to households, okay? Right, and firms actually use your factor of production to actually make a good or a service. So back to the analogy of the coffee shop, right? You have these workers, you have these machines, and you have this building. All of them come together to basically make a coffee shop, okay? I mean, to basically make coffee, okay? So firms sell the coffee, right? In what we call the goods market. So the goods market is where goods and services are sold and bought. And households, we go to the goods market to buy these services. Okay, so for example, a firm makes TV using labor, and then we go to the market to go buy TV. Okay, right. And from this, we can say we have what we call consumption expenditure. And consumption expenditure is the total payment for consumer goods and services. Okay, so for example, when I buy a TV, I buy an iPhone, I buy an Apple. That's an example of consumption expenditure and is generally labeled as C. Okay, when firms also buy and sell new equipment, right, from the goods market, because sometimes firms actually go into the goods market to actually maybe buy a machine produced by another firm to actually produce their own goods. Okay, and sometimes firms also put unsold output into what we call inventory. Okay, so that's their inventory, things they actually make but they haven't sold yet. Okay, they actually put it in the goods market, and this is known as investment and is usually shown by an I. Okay, right. So households, okay, basically go into the goods market, okay, they buy goods and services, and this comes in the form of income to firms, okay, as we've seen by the C. and by the red arrow. Okay. In some cases, firms also buy investments, right? Remember, they actually buy investments also. Okay. In the goods market, and this same investment comes back in the form of income to other firms, and also firms putting unsold inventory in the goods market. Okay, right, so that is the expenditure side. Okay, that is the expenditure side. Now let's look at governments. Okay, so governments also buy goods and services from firms, right? And their expenditure is known as government expenditure. Okay, their expenditure is known as government expenditure. Okay, and government expenditure, as we show in the circular flow diagram, is basically shown by the red flow, which is basically this G. Okay, right. So, for example, if government goes to Lockheed Martin to buy some military equipment, that's an example of a government expenditure. Okay, if government goes to Boeing to buy some planes, that is an example of a government expenditure. Okay, so government expenditure is when the government basically purchases a good or a service and in return gets something back. Okay, governments also have certain expenditures, but we don't really consider them as government expenditure in economics. Okay, so for example, unemployment benefits is an example of a government sort of expenditure, but it's not really considered in GDP. The government also sometimes pays subsidies to firms. Okay, the government also gives transfer payments. These are not included in the circular flow, or these are not sort of considered as expenditures. Why? Because the government does not get anything in return. It's almost like the government is basically given free money. Okay, right. So we can see the government also going into the goods market, and this expenditure eventually becomes income to firms. Okay, and this income, think of it as the same income. So when firm gets income from investment, consumption, and government expenditures, the same amount of income, that is what they use to pay people in the factor market, essentially. Okay. And then finally, we have the rest of the world. Okay, so for the rest of the world, we need to look at exports because we actually interact with the rest of the world. So exports is when the United States, right, produces a good and sells it to the rest of the world. Okay, so for example, the United States produces Nike shoes, right, in the United States, and they sell it to the rest of the world. It's an example of an export. If the United States produces, let's say, Apple iPhones in the United States and sell it to the rest of the world, is an example of an export. Okay, if the United States produces Polo Ralph Lauren clothing and sells to the rest of the world or foreigners, is basically an export. Okay, and imports is when we buy goods and services made from the rest of the world. Okay, imports is when we buy goods and services made from the rest of the world. And in our notation, we will say imports is basically defined as X. So the value of imports is defined as X, and the value of imports is defined as M, right? And we call, since we're actually looking at GDP, right? Remember, we said GDP is basically what is produced in the country. We need to subtract our imports from our exports. So we call that net exports, and that is exports, which is X minus M. Okay, right, so that is essentially our net exports. Okay, and if net exports are positive, it means that there's a whole lot of goods flowing from the United States to the rest of the world, down goods flowing from the rest of the world to the United States. And if net exports are negative, it means that the flow of goods from the United States to the rest of the world is less than goods flowing from the rest of the world to the United States. Okay, and we can actually show this in our circular flow diagram. Okay, so we have net exports, right, also going into the goods market, and from there it basically goes into firms' pockets. Okay, right, so the sum of all the expenditure should basically equal income. Okay, so all this expenditure, right, is basically going to firms, and firms basically pay this expenditure out in the form of income. Okay, so income, which is Y, should equal expenditure. Okay, So this is where we end the video. And next time we'll look at how to actually calculate GDP using what we call the expenditure approach.